The kennel door didn't just close, it slammed shut like a vault, and the sound hit every person watching through that reinforced glass window like a physical thing. The German Shepherd on the other side of that enclosure had already put 2 handlers in the emergency room that week. It had stopped eating, it had stopped responding to commands. The military had labeled it a danger to personnel and signed the euthanasia order that morning. And now, a 31-year-old nurse in scrubs was locked inside with it, alone, no weapon, no protective gear, radio already cut, and the dog had just spotted her. It dropped its head. It charged. Every person standing at that window held their breath. Some of them had already looked away. None of them knew who Emily Dawson actually was. If this story already has you gripped, follow the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most of Emily's mornings started at Blackridge Veterans Medical Center, with someone making sure she knew she didn't belong there. She'd come in at 6:40, 20 minutes before her shift, which she did every day because the overnight nurses were always running behind, and someone needed to do the medication reconciliation before rounds. She didn't do it because anyone asked her to. She did it because the patients needed it done, and nobody else was doing it. That was more or less the story of her time at Blackridge. She was pulling charts at the nursing station when Supervisor Diane Hollis walked past, saw the stack of files in Emily's hands, and stopped. "Those are Dr. Mercer's patients," Hollis said. "I know. I'm updating the reconciliation logs before morning rounds." "That's not your assignment." Emily looked up from the chart. "It wasn't done." Hollis stared at her for a moment with the particular expression she reserved for Emily. Not quite contempt, not quite impatience. Something that blended both into something more efficient. "You're covering Ward C today. Stick to your assignment, Dawson." The overnight team was short 2 people. "The logs." "I said stick to your assignment." She put the charts back. She went to Ward C. She did her job so thoroughly and quietly that by 9 a.m., 3 different patients had asked the charge nurse to pass along their thanks to the one who actually listens. The charge nurse, whose name was Priya Nair, and who was the only person at Blackridge Emily fully trusted, relayed this information in the break room with a small, careful smile. "They love you," Priya said, pouring bad coffee from the communal pot. "Hollis just told me to stop updating logs that weren't done." "I know." Priya handed her a cup. "I also know you finished them anyway on your break." Emily didn't answer. She drank the coffee. It was terrible. Blackridge Veterans Medical Center sat at the eastern edge of Stonehaven, Arizona, where the desert started to take back the city in earnest. Scrub brush pushing through asphalt cracks, dust settling on window ledges regardless of how often they were cleaned. It was a Level 2 trauma facility that handled a significant volume of military-connected patients due to its proximity to Fort Vanguard, 40 minutes worth. The hospital had 340 beds, a surgical wing that ran around the clock, and an administrative structure that had calcified over years into something rigid and territorial. The kind of place where seniority meant more than competence, and the people who asked too many questions had a way of finding their schedules rearranged. Emily had been there 14 months. She was still, as far as the senior staff was concerned, temporary. Not in terms of her contract, that was full-time, permanent. Temporary in the sense that people like Diane Hollis and Chief Administrator Victor Kane had decided she didn't fit the culture here, which was their polite way of saying she didn't fit their idea of what a nurse at Blackridge was supposed to be. She was quiet in the wrong way. She didn't socialize at the right times. She had a habit of documenting things carefully, thoroughly, with the kind of specificity that made people uncomfortable when they suspected their shortcuts might one day be reviewed. She was also, and this was the thing they kept coming back to, 31 years old with no background in emergency medicine before Blackridge, no prestigious program on her CV, no champion on the medical staff who vouched for her. She had come in through a standard hiring process, passed every assessment, and started work. That was it. That was the whole story, as far as they knew. They didn't know much. The incident with the kennel had started 2 days earlier, when the hospital received a request from Fort Vanguard's K9 unit. There was a German Shepherd, operational designation Bravo 7, 4 years old, recently returned from overseas deployment, that had been flagged for psychological evaluation following an incident in which it had attacked its handler without clear provocation. The handler had required 17 stitches. A second assessment handler had gone in 2 days later, and the dog had put him against the wall hard enough to fracture 2 ribs. The K9 program's veterinary coordinator, a quiet man named Dr. Elliot Marsh, had requested access to Blackridge's animal-capable isolation suite, which the hospital maintained for the occasional military working dog that came through in connection with veteran care programs. It was a specialized facility, reinforced enclosure, observation window, behavioral assessment setup. Marsh wanted to evaluate the dog in a clinical environment before the euthanasia order was finalized. Administrator Kane had agreed to the arrangement, apparently without giving it much thought. What happened next had Kane's fingerprints on it from the beginning, though Emily didn't understand that yet when Hollis pulled her out of Ward C at 10:15 and told her she was being reassigned. "We need someone in the K9 observation suite," Hollis said. "I'm a patient care nurse." "You're whatever this hospital needs you to be today, Dawson. Dr. Marsh needs a clinical observer during the behavioral assessment. Priya suggested you had some background with animals." Emily hadn't told anyone here about her background. Not the useful parts. Priya knew some of it, had asked questions once, early on, and Emily had answered carefully, giving enough to satisfy without giving the whole picture. She hadn't lied. She'd just not explained. "Priya said that?" Emily asked. "Are you going or not?" She went. The K9 suite was in the East Wing basement, a level below the main trauma floor, accessible through a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and old concrete. Emily had been down here twice before, both times to check in on veteran patients who were doing pet therapy sessions with certified animals. Those had been calm visits. Soft dogs, soft light, men and women who'd been through hard things sitting on the floor, letting a Labrador put its head in their lap. This was different. She heard the dog before she saw it. A low sound, not quite a bark, that resonated through the concrete and settled somewhere in her chest. She recognized it. The register of an animal that had stopped trusting and hadn't yet decided if it wanted to fight or disappear. She'd heard that sound before, more times than she could easily count. Doctor. Marsh was standing outside the observation window with a tablet and the specific expression of someone who had run out of options. He was a compact man, 50s, gray at the temples, with the careful eyes of a person accustomed to reading animals. He looked at Emily when she came through the door, and something in his posture shifted slightly. Not relief exactly, but a reduction in tension. "You're Dawson?" he said. "Yes." "Your supervisor said you had animal experience." "Some." He looked at her for a moment. "Some is more than anyone else offered." He gestured toward the observation window. "His name is Bravo 7. Real name's Duke. He's been in operational service for 4 years. 3 overseas deployments. He was bonded to a handler named Corporal James Ewan, who died in a vehicle ambush 8 months ago. Duke was in the vehicle. He survived. He's been in 3 different placement situations since, and none of them have held." Emily looked through the glass. The German Shepherd was at the far end of the enclosure, pressed into the corner, body low. Big animal, 90 pounds at least, all of it muscle and nerve, and something that had been wound too tight for too long. The fur along his spine was raised. His eyes, when he moved them to track the window, were not the eyes of a dangerous animal. They were the eyes of one in serious pain. "The euthanasia order," Emily said, "signed this morning. I requested the evaluation as a final review. If I can document behavioral indicators that suggest treatability, there's a case for appeal." Marsh paused. 2 people have already been hurt." "I know, I read the file on the way down." She turned to him. "What do you need from me?" "I need someone in the enclosure during the assessment, low-profile presence. Behavioral observation partner. I'll be on radio and camera, monitoring from out here. The assessment protocol calls for a human presence inside." Emily nodded. "Okay. You understand what this animal has done?" "Yes." He studied her. Most people said no. She was already moving toward the enclosure door. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Victor Kane had been watching the security feed on his office monitor for the last 40 minutes. He had seen Marsh's request. He had seen Hollis redirect Emily. He had made a phone call to the building systems manager, a man who owed him several significant favors, and he had arranged for the enclosure's radio system to be cycled into maintenance mode at a specific time. She was the problem he hadn't been able to solve in 14 months. Too careful, too thorough, too hard to formally discipline because she never actually did anything wrong. But she made people uncomfortable. She documented things. 3 months ago, she had filed a clinical quality report flagging a pattern in surgical supply ordering that suggested discrepancies. The report had gone up the chain and come back down with no findings, but Kane had read it, and Kane understood what it meant, and Kane had been looking for a way to manage this particular employee ever since. This was the way. An uncontrolled environment, a documented high-risk animal, a nurse with no formal animal handling credentials making a decision to enter an enclosure she arguably shouldn't have entered. If something went wrong, it was her judgment call. If the radio happened to be down, he could claim equipment malfunction. If she resigned under the resulting pressure or was formally censured for the incident, the quality report investigation lost its primary witness. He had thought it through. He had not thought about who Emily Dawson was before she became a nurse at Black Ridge Veterans Medical Center. Imamtik. She entered the enclosure at 10:47. The moment the door sealed behind her, she heard Marcia's voice crackle on the radio, confirming connection. She clicked her acknowledgement and then stood still, just inside the door, and didn't look directly at Duke. This was the first thing most people got wrong. They came in looking for the animal. They tracked it with their eyes, broadcasting exactly the kind of predatory fixation that told a stressed dog its threat assessment was correct. Emily came in looking at the middle distance. She let Duke see her body language first. She kept her shoulders down and her hands loose, and she breathed through her nose slowly. Duke, in the corner, lifted his head. She moved to the left side of the enclosure and lowered herself. Not abruptly, not fast, but with the particular kind of deliberate slowness that says, I am not a threat, and I am also not afraid. She sat on the concrete floor with her back half turned to the dog and waited. Through the observation window, Marsh was very still. Outside the window, in the corridor that ran parallel to the observation room, Hollis had come down to watch. She had brought 2 other nurses with her. Emily didn't know this. She was focused on the sound of Duke's breathing, the shift of his weight, the incremental change in the quality of the air in the enclosure as the animal began to make its first recalculations. He moved at 11:02. Not a charge. A slow, suspicious approach, stopping 3 times, body still tensed, ready to reverse. Emily didn't react. When he got close enough that she could hear him sniffing, she turned her head toward him at about 45 degrees and let him see her profile, which was less threatening than facing him and more engaged than ignoring him. He stopped. He sniffed the air. She said something very quietly, 2 words, in a low register. Duke's ears shifted. She said it again. His body didn't relax. That was too fast, too much to expect. But the hackles along his spine dropped 2 inches. He took 1 more step forward, and then he sat. Not a trained behavior, not a command response. He just sat, the way a very tired creature sits when it has been convinced, for the first time in a long time, that it doesn't have to be ready for the next catastrophe right this second. Marsh exhaled so hard it fogged the observation glass. In the corridor, Hollis had gone quiet. Emily raised her hand very slowly and let Duke smell her knuckles. He leaned into it, just slightly. Not affectionate yet. Nothing like trust, but the beginning of something. The fragile first edge of a connection between a broken animal and a woman who understood, in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it, exactly what the inside of that kind of pain felt like. She was still there at 11:30 when the radio went dead. She heard it first as a burst of static, then silence. She clicked the talk button twice. Nothing. She looked at the observation window. Marsh was on his phone. She could see him through the glass, standing, his face different now, tight. She looked at the door. The panel light that indicated the electronic lock was green had changed to amber. That wasn't a standard color. That wasn't part of the protocol she'd been briefed on. She didn't move quickly. Duke was still close, still in the fragile early territory of almost calm, and a sudden movement would undo the last 40 minutes and possibly a great deal more. She moved to the door slowly, touched the panel, pressed the release. Nothing. She pressed it again. The amber light held steady. Through the glass, Marsh had his hand flat against the window now, and his mouth was moving, but she couldn't hear him. She read lips well enough to get 2 words. Not me. The lock hadn't failed. It had been engaged from outside. She heard, through the heavy door, a sound she recognized after a moment as the kennel's steel secondary gate, the one at the far end of the enclosure behind the interior dividing wall, disengaging. A mechanical sound, precise, deliberate. Someone had activated the release remotely. Then the sound behind the dividing wall changed. Duke heard it before she did. He was on his feet in an instant, every line of his body transformed, the almost calm gone completely, replaced by something electric and animal and very old. He'd heard that sound before. The opening of a gate. The creak of something moving. In how many contexts Emily could only imagine. His training, his deployments. The last moment before Corporal James Ewan's vehicle hit whatever it hit. He dropped his head. His eyes fixed on the source of the sound, on the partition wall, not on her, and he began to move, low and fast, toward the back of the enclosure. But the gate behind the wall opened into this enclosure. Whatever was behind it would come through into her space. She had approximately 4 seconds to understand this and make a decision. She moved to the center of the enclosure and crouched. She didn't pick up the thing her hands had found automatically, the assessment clipboard that had been left on the floor, and she didn't go for the door again. She stayed where she was, in the middle, and she let her body do what her body knew how to do. Duke hit the interior partition at full speed, bounced off it, spun, and then the gate opened and a second dog, smaller, also military trained, also clearly in distress, came through the gap and immediately targeted the nearest human shape in the enclosure, which was Emily. She had just enough time to think. Hollis wouldn't have known about this. This is Kane. Then the dog was in the air. What happened next lasted 11 seconds by the security camera's timestamp, though it felt longer than that to the people watching through the observation glass and considerably shorter to Emily. She didn't run. She didn't fight. She did something that the 3 nurses in that corridor would describe differently in the days that followed, each description shaped by what they'd been expecting to see versus what they'd actually witnessed. She caught the animal's momentum and redirected it. Not a trained security technique, something more specific than that, something that required reading the exact angle and velocity of the approach and positioning herself to neither absorb the impact nor trigger the follow-through. Duke, behind her, had stopped moving. He was watching. The second dog hit the floor sideways, not injured, not escalated, stunned. Emily held its attention with her voice, low, continuous, a specific cadence, and didn't stop talking. By the time the building systems manager, clearly panicked, restored power to the observation suite, and the door unsealed itself, both dogs were on the floor of the enclosure, neither of them attacking, both of them watching Emily Dawson with the specific, concentrated attention that animals reserve for the things they've decided, despite everything, they might be able to trust. Marsh came through the door first. He stopped when he saw them. He looked at Emily. She was on the floor, her scrubs dirty, her hands completely still. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "How?" He stopped, started again. The lock shouldn't have. Someone activated the gate remotely. The secondary kennel wasn't supposed to be. "I know," Emily said. She could hear Hollis in the corridor behind him, a rapid, half-whispered conversation on a phone. She could hear the building settling around her, the ventilation system, the particular hum of a hospital floor resuming its normal frequency after a disruption. She stayed on the floor a moment longer. Duke had lowered his head onto his front paws, 8 inches from her knee. He wasn't looking at the door anymore. She put her hand on his head. He didn't flinch. "His name isn't Bravo 7, she said quietly, to Marsh, to no one in particular. "His name was Duke, and he's going to be okay." Upstairs, in his office on the 4th floor, Victor Kane was reviewing the security feed from the enclosure. He had watched the whole thing. He understood what he was looking at. The 11 seconds. The 2 animals. The nurse sitting on the floor without a scratch on her. He picked up his phone and called his legal contact. He was going to need to get ahead of this. He was going to need documentation. Incident reports framing Emily's entry into the enclosure as an unauthorized decision. Witness statements from staff who'd seen her go in voluntarily. A clear paper trail establishing that any failures in the security system were pre-existing infrastructure issues, unrelated to any specific personnel action. He started making calls. He was still making them when the first military vehicles came through the hospital's main gate. 4 of them, moving fast, the kind of vehicles that don't stop for hospital speed limits, and the kind of men riding in them who don't wait at reception desks. And behind the vehicles, 2 black helicopters that descended toward the rooftop landing pad with a precision that told anyone watching that whoever was aboard had not arrived here by accident. Kane heard the helicopters. He went to his window. He looked down at the parking lot, at the vehicles, at the men already moving toward the entrance in a formation that had nothing casual about it. His phone was still in his hand. He didn't finish the call. Down in the East Wing basement, Emily heard the helicopters too. She was still on the floor of the enclosure, still beside Duke, and she tilted her head slightly at the sound, the specific sound of military rotors at low altitude, the descent pattern, and something in her expression changed. Not alarm, something older than alarm, recognition. She stood up slowly. "Dr. Marsh," she said. "Something's happened." Marsh was already moving toward the door, his tablet forgotten on the floor, when Emily said it, and the way she said it stopped him mid-step. Not panicked, not guessing. The kind of statement that carries weight, because the person saying it has heard that sound before and knows exactly what it means. "How do you know?" he said. "2 helicopters, low approach, tight formation. That's not a medevac pattern." She was pulling Duke's assessment lead from the hook by the door, clipping it to his collar with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it hundreds of times in worse conditions than this. "That's a tactical insert. Something came in hot, and they're redirecting it here." Marsh stared at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen before on people encountering the gap between who they thought she was and who she actually was. He didn't say anything. He followed her out. The corridor was different from how it had been 40 minutes ago. The quality of the noise from the floors above had changed, the kind of change that spreads through a hospital the way weather changes, people moving faster and in new directions. The particular pitch of radio traffic that means something outside normal parameters has entered the system. Hollis was gone from the observation corridor. 2 orderlies were pushing an empty gurney toward the elevator at a pace that said they'd been told to hurry but not why. Emily took the stairs. Duke came with her, not perfectly. He pulled left at the first landing, spooked by the sound from the stairwell above. But she held the lead steady and kept moving, and he sorted himself out by the second floor. Animals under stress needed consistency more than they needed instruction. She knew that. She applied it to Duke the same way she applied it to patients, the same way she applied it to most situations that were deteriorating around the edges. The main corridor on ground level was controlled chaos, which was different from actual chaos in ways that mattered. Staff were moving with purpose rather than panic, which meant the charge system was still functional, which meant someone was running triage effectively. She could see through the glass doors to the ambulance bay, where 2 military vehicles had positioned themselves in an arrangement that blocked civilian traffic but left the trauma lane clear. A third vehicle was parked sideways, which was either deliberate tactical positioning or someone had gotten out in a hurry and not thought about it. Given the other 2, she suspected the former. Priya appeared from the medication room, saw Emily, saw Duke on the lead behind her, and did not ask any of the questions that were clearly forming on her face. This was one of the things Emily valued about her. "Mass casualty?" Emily said. "They're calling it a critical transfer. Military convoy, ambushed about 12 miles north on Route 9. At least 6 casualties, 2 critical. They're bringing them here because Fort Vanguard's surgical suite is down for maintenance and we're the nearest level 2. Priya's voice was steady, but her hands were doing the thing they did when she was managing more stress than she was showing, a small, repetitive motion with her right thumb against her palm. "They also said there's a senior official involved. I don't have a name." "What do they need?" "Trauma 1 and 2 are already being set up. They want a senior clinical coordinator in the main bay, and Dr. Mercer is—" Priya stopped. "Mercer's in surgery. He won't be out for 40 minutes minimum." Emily looked at the bay. She looked at Duke. She turned and found the nearest available space, a supply alcove with a short bench and a ventilation grate, and walked Duke into it. She clipped his lead to the bench bracket, checked that it was solid, and crouched in front of him. He was trembling slightly. Not visible to anyone who wasn't looking closely, just a fine tremor in his shoulders, the physical expression of a nervous system that hadn't had a safe moment in 8 months. She put her hand on his chest, felt his heartbeat under her palm. "Stay," she said quietly. Not a command tone, a reassurance. His ears flicked. He sat. She stood and looked at Priya. "Who's running the bay?" "Technically Hollis." They both paused for a moment. "Where is she?" Emily asked. "I haven't seen her in 20 minutes. Her radio's on, but she hasn't responded to 2 pages." Emily was already moving toward the bay. She went through the double doors and took in the room in about 4 seconds. The way the space was set up, who was in it, where the gaps were. 2 trauma nurses she recognized, Martinez and Kwan, were managing supply setup with the focused silence of competent people working a problem. A respiratory tech was running a ventilator check. The military medic standing near the door had his kit bag open on the counter and was doing his own inventory in parallel to the hospital's, which was sensible given that whatever they'd triaged in the field had started 14 miles out and conditions would have changed in transit. The medic looked up when she came in. His eyes did a quick read of her. Scrubs, no badge visible, dog lead still in her left hand, Duke not present but the lead's clip end showing. His face asked the question, his mouth didn't. "Emily Dawson, clinical staff," she said. "Charge is unavailable. What's your field assessment?" He hesitated 1 beat, measuring her. 6 transferred, 2 priority 1. Thoracic trauma and a head injury. Both stable-ish in transport, but the thoracic is going to need surgical review fast. 3 priority 2. Shrapnel, 1 with a tension pneumo we treated on scene. 1 priority 3. Walking wounded. He's going to be fine, but he'll complain the whole time. He almost added something to that last line, something personal, the kind of dark, half-joke field medics make, because the alternative is not making it. He stopped himself. The official, the one they're concerned about, is the thoracic. His name is classified, but he's got full military escort, and there are going to be people in this room in about 4 minutes who are going to want everything to stop while they secure the space. And everything can't stop. "No," he said. "It really can't." "Okay." She turned to Martinez. "What's our blood supply situation?" "Typo negative is down to 6 units. We've got a call into the bank. Get a second call in priority and flag it as potential mass casualty. Don't wait for them to confirm the first request. Kwan, the ventilator in Bay 2 has been running a pressure calibration error for the past 3 weeks. Facilities logged it and didn't fix it. Do not use that ventilator for any patient who isn't stable and self-managing. Use the portable from the crash cart in the hall if you need backup capacity." Kwan stared at her. "How do you know about the calibration error?" "I read the maintenance logs. It's on page 4 of last month's report. Move it." Kwan moved. The first ambulance pulled into the bay 32 seconds later. What followed was an hour and 19 minutes that Emily would not, afterward, be able to fully reconstruct in sequence. It had the quality of all real emergencies. Not cinematic, not clean, the opposite of everything that gets described in reports filed 2 days later, when there's time to impose narrative order on what was actually a series of barely managed decisions made faster than conscious thought allows. The thoracic case came in first, and the surgeon on call, Dr. Reyes, was there in 4 minutes, which was a kind of miracle that Emily filed away as something she owed Priya for, because Priya had clearly made a phone call she wasn't going to explain. The field medic's assessment had been accurate. The patient was deteriorating but not yet in freefall, and Reyes took 1 look at the imaging and said 2 words that meant they were going to surgery and going now. The military escort that came with the thoracic patient was 4 men, armed, in full kit, and they made the space very small very quickly. One of them positioned himself at the door in a way that was not quite blocking it, but was making a clear statement about who was moving through it. Emily walked past him without pausing, got the medication she needed, came back through the same way. He watched her. He didn't stop her. Something in the way she moved had told him something he hadn't expected to be told. She didn't notice. She was focused on the patient. The priority 2 cases came through sequentially over the next 30 minutes. The shrapnel wounds, the pneumothorax that the field medic had treated beautifully on scene and now needed monitoring and rest rather than intervention, the walking wounded man who was, as advertised, vocal about his condition in a way that was mostly the sound of someone who'd been terrified for 2 hours and needed somewhere to put it. Emily managed 3 of these simultaneously with Martinez and a second nurse who'd been pulled from Ward C, and she did it without raising her voice once, without any of the particular brand of controlled panic that she'd seen consume other people in other crises. Hollis appeared at 12:37. Emily knew the time because she'd been watching the clock above Bay 2, tracking the thoracic patient's surgical timeline against what Reyes had projected. When Hollis came through the door, Emily was reading a vitals printout and didn't look up immediately. Dawson. Hollis's voice had a texture to it that hadn't been there that morning. Not quite anger, something more uncomfortable than anger. What are you doing in this bay? Clinical coordination. You were unavailable. I was handling the incident report from the kennel situation. Emily looked up then. During a mass casualty intake. The silence between those two sentences was about 3 seconds long and very loud. That's not your call to make, Hollis said. No, it was yours, and you weren't here to make it. Emily set down the printout. She wasn't going to do this in front of Martinez, Kwan, the military medic, and the 3 patients currently in various states of consciousness in the bays around them. She was also not, she decided, going to pretend the conversation wasn't happening. We can talk about chain of command after the critical patients are stabilized. Right now I need the blood bank status, and I need someone to check on the patient in Bay 3 who hasn't been seen in... She looked at the clock. 11 minutes. Hollis's mouth tightened, but she turned and went to Bay 3. Emily went back to the vitals printout. Martinez, who had been very carefully looking at his supply cart, exhaled slowly through his nose. It was the military medic who first asked her directly. His name, she learned in the way you learn things during controlled emergencies, in fragments, sideways, was Corporal Adana. He was good at his job in the specific way that field medics get good, which is through repetition and necessity rather than perfect conditions. And he'd been keeping pace with her through the priority 2 cases with a focused efficiency that she respected. At 1:15, during a gap of about 4 minutes, where the immediate demands had eased enough for both of them to stand at the same counter reviewing the same chart, he said without looking at her, "You've done this before." "Nursing?" "Yes." "Not what I mean." She kept reading the chart. "The dog," he said. "The way you came in here. The blood bank call, the ventilator." He paused. "The way you walked past Sergeant Torres at the door." "Torres," she said. "That's the man stationed at the entrance. He doesn't let people walk past him. He let me." "Yeah." Adana was quiet for a moment. "That's what I mean." She looked up from the chart. She looked at him directly, which she didn't always do with people she'd just met, because it tended to make them ask more questions. He was younger than she'd initially assessed, late 20s probably, with the kind of face that had been weathered beyond its years by outdoor conditions and bad sleep, and the specific emotional labor of being the person other people bled on. "I've worked in high-pressure environments before nursing," she said. That was accurate. That was the most accurate thing she could say, that also revealed nothing she wasn't prepared to have become part of the hospital's institutional knowledge. Adana nodded slowly. He looked like he was going to say something else, but at that moment Torres appeared in the doorway and said, "We've got a situation in the corridor." And Adana's full attention shifted instantly, which was a field reflex she recognized. She followed. The corridor outside the trauma bay had become complicated in the way hospital corridors become complicated when institutions collide. Military protocol meeting hospital administration, each side asserting its authority over the shared space in ways that were technically civil and functionally not. The situation Torres had referenced was Victor Kane, who had come downstairs. She hadn't seen Kane in person in 6 weeks, which was approximately how long she'd been aware that the quality control report was making him uncomfortable. She knew what he looked like from staff meetings and the framed photo outside his office. A heavy-set man in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the way that people use clothing to assert authority they're not certain they actually have. The kind of administrator who had learned to weaponize process. He was standing in the corridor with 2 men she didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, both with the particular posture of lawyers or compliance officers. And he was having a conversation with the military escort officer that had the surface texture of a professional exchange and the underlying energy of two pressure systems meeting. Understand the situation, Kane was saying. But this facility's emergency protocols require that administrative leadership be involved in any coordinated response. Sir, the coordinated response is happening. It doesn't require your involvement at this stage. The escort officer's voice was flat and final in the way that military training produces. I'd ask you to let the clinical staff continue their work. I am the chief administrator of this hospital. The clinical staff reports to... The clinical staff is currently keeping 6 soldiers alive. I'd appreciate your patience. Kane's eyes moved through the corridor, scanning, looking for leverage, for a face he could redirect the conversation toward. They landed on Emily. The expression that crossed his face lasted less than a second. Surprise, then calculation, then something that was trying very hard to look like professional concern. Nurse Dawson, he said loud enough to carry. I'm glad to see you're unhurt. We've been very concerned about what happened in the kennel this morning. I've asked Dr. Hollis to prepare a full incident report. This isn't the time, Emily said. It absolutely is. An unauthorized entry into a restricted... I said this isn't the time. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. There are critical patients 30 feet from where you're standing. If you need to speak with me about an incident report, you know where my office is. She didn't have an office. Nurses at Blackridge didn't get offices. She'd made that up on her feet, and the precision of it, the calm confidence of someone claiming a space she technically didn't have, stopped Kane long enough that the escort officer stepped slightly into his sightline and the moment passed. Emily went back through the bay doors. Behind her, she heard Torres say quietly, to no one in particular, "Who is she?" She didn't hear Adana's answer. She was already back at the chart. The colonel arrived at 2:45. She knew he'd come. She'd known it since the helicopters. Not who specifically, not this person, but someone at a level of command that warranted this response. And when command arrived at a facility in an active situation, it always came in person to assess. She'd been part of those assessments. She knew the shape of them. She was in the corridor outside Bay 1, reviewing the post-surgical handoff notes from Reyes, when she heard the shift in the quality of sound from the main entrance. The kind of shift that happens when rank walks into a space and people unconsciously rearrange themselves. She looked up. Colonel Marcus Reed was not a large man. This surprised people who hadn't met him. He was average height, lean, somewhere in his mid-50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that doesn't come from effort, but from having held a specific relationship with physical discipline for so long that it had simply become the architecture of his body. He wore no visible decorations on his field uniform, which told her something, because men who needed to establish dominance in unfamiliar spaces usually had their decorations visible. He walked through the entrance with 2 aides and Torres flanking him, and he was scanning the room the way she'd seen field commanders scan rooms, which was not left to right like civilians reading text, but in a specific pattern that assessed threat, resource, and personnel simultaneously. His scan reached her and stopped. She watched it stop. She watched his face do a thing that was very subtle and very specific, a micro-expression of recognition that he controlled immediately, pulling it back behind the command face, but it had been there. Real. Involuntary. He said something to the aide on his left without looking at him. The aide nodded and moved toward Torres. Reed came forward alone. She stood still. She was holding the handoff notes in her left hand, and she didn't put them down because putting them down would have been a gesture, and this was not a moment for gestures. She waited. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked at her for a moment that was longer than standard clinical introductions. "Dawson," he said. He said it the way you say a name when you haven't said it out loud in years, but you've thought it, the way you say the name of something that took you by surprise in a context where you weren't expecting surprises. "Colonel Reed," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. The controlled approximation of one, from a man who'd trained himself out of visible emotional responses in professional contexts, but was being reminded of why he had developed that skill in the first place. "You're a nurse," he said. "Yes." "Here." "Yes." He looked around the bay. At the controlled activity, the staff moving with the rhythm that good triage coordination produces, the specific absence of chaos in what had 40 minutes ago been a potential disaster. Then back at her. You coordinated the response, he said. It wasn't a question. The charge nurse was unavailable. The field medic briefed me. He paused. He also told me about the dog. She didn't say anything. 2 dogs, Reed said. Secondary kennel opened remotely, radio down. He was watching her face with the attention of someone reading information off a surface that doesn't broadcast it clearly. That's not an equipment failure. No, she said. It's not. You know whose decision that was. I have a clear enough picture. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the corridor continued its work. Gurneys, clipboards, the beep of monitors, the specific ambient sound of people doing difficult things carefully. Reed looked like he was solving a problem, which she recognized because she'd watched him solve problems before, in context that made this one look manageable. I'm going to need your full account, he said. The kennel, the intake, all of it, on record. I'll give it. The man whose records I'm looking at, Reed said. The administrator. Kane. Kane. He said it without inflection, which was a more complete statement than inflection would have been. He filed an incident report 40 minutes ago. It characterizes this morning's kennel situation as a safety violation by a civilian staff member who entered a restricted enclosure without authorization. Emily looked at him steadily. He got there first, she said. He did. He had time. He knew what happened was going to need explaining. Yes. Reed looked at her for another moment. He's also, in the last hour, placed calls to 3 members of the hospital's legal team and 1 city council member. He paused. We know about the calls because the phones in this building are on a military communications network right now for the duration of the emergency response. He didn't know that. The thing about Victor Kane, Emily thought, was that he was not stupid. He was careful and strategic and had spent years constructing an administrative environment in which he controlled the flow of information. What he had miscalculated, what people like him always miscalculated, was the point at which the environment changed faster than they could adapt. He'd built his system inside a hospital. He'd assumed the hospital was the largest relevant context. It wasn't. There's more, she said. Not a question. We started pulling the security footage for this facility as part of the emergency response protocol, Reed said. We needed full situational awareness of the building. He stopped. The building systems manager accessed the kennel's secondary gate release remotely at 10:53 this morning. There's a record of that access. There's also a record of a phone call to his direct line from extension 412 at 10:41. Kane's office, she said. Kane's office. She absorbed this. She felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph, not relief. Something more complicated than either. The specific weight of having held something that was wrong for a long time and now feeling the first change in its pressure. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like the moment before you can breathe again. He was going to use the incident report to push me out, she said. If the dog had hurt me, it would have been my poor judgment. If I'd quit under the pressure, he'd have an undisputed narrative. Yes. There's also a quality control report, Emily said, filed 3 months ago. Surgical supply discrepancies. It went up the chain and came back with no findings. Reed looked at her. I have copies, she said, of the original report and of the version that came back. Are they different? The version that came back is missing 4 pages. He was quiet for a long moment. The corridor moved around them, and Emily was aware of people tracking this conversation without appearing to track it. Martinez at the medication cart, Adana near the bay door, Hollis somewhere behind her. She didn't turn to check. She kept her eyes on Reed. Dawson, he said, how long has this been going on? 14 months, she said, give or take. He exhaled, a short, controlled sound that on a different man might have been something louder. You should have... He stopped himself, started differently. Why didn't you escalate? It was a fair question. She'd thought about it. She'd thought about it a great deal, in the particular way you think about decisions you've already made and can no longer revise. I escalated through channels available to me. The report was the 3rd thing I filed. The previous 2 went nowhere. She paused. I also... She stopped. It was harder to say this part. I knew how it would look. A nurse, 14 months in, no seniority, no institutional backing, saying the chief administrator was engineering her exit. The story writes itself as the disgruntled employee who thinks the rules don't apply to her. So you waited. I documented. I waited for something that couldn't be reframed. Reed looked at her for a long moment. The kennel. I didn't arrange that, she said quickly. I need to be clear. I know you didn't, he said. I know. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. He handed it to you. He handed it to himself, she said. I just didn't disappear when he expected me to. The second aide appeared at Reed's elbow then, a young lieutenant with the expression of someone carrying time-sensitive information and waiting for the right moment. Reed turned slightly. The lieutenant leaned in, said something Emily couldn't hear. Reed's posture changed, not dramatically, a degree or two toward formal. I have to take a briefing, he said to Emily, but I need you at the review this evening, 1800 hours, full account, on record with the documentation. He paused. All of it. I'll be there. He nodded. He started to turn and then stopped, turned back. The command face was in place, but something underneath it was doing something else. Something she recognized as the expression of a person who knew things they couldn't say in a hallway, but wanted the other person to know they knew. The dog, he said. Duke, is he? He's in an alcove off the east corridor. He's okay. She paused. He's going to be okay. Reed looked at her for one more moment. Then he went with his aide, and Emily watched him go, and she stood in the corridor for about 15 seconds after he was gone before she moved. She needed to get back to the bay. She had a patient in Bay 3 who was due for a medication check, and the blood bank hadn't confirmed the second supply call, and Martinez had been on his feet for 7 hours without a break, and Duke was alone in an alcove and probably wondering why the anchor he'd just decided to trust had disappeared. She had a lot to do before 1800 hours. She turned back toward the bay and almost walked directly into Diane Hollis, who had apparently been standing close enough to hear at least the last part of that conversation. Hollis's face had changed. The contempt that had always been the base layer of her expressions when she looked at Emily was still there, but something was growing over the top of it that Emily recognized after a moment as the first early signal of fear. The specific kind of fear that comes not from danger, but from revision. From a person realizing that the picture they've been working from has just been replaced by a different, larger picture that changes everything they thought they understood. Dawson, Hollis started. Not now, Emily said and kept walking. She made it 12 steps before she heard the sound from behind her, from the direction of the main entrance, from the area where Kane's legal contact had been standing with 2 compliance officers 40 minutes ago. A raised voice, followed by the specific clipped tone of a military officer stating something that was not negotiable. Then Kane's voice, still controlled, still performing the character of a man who had authority here, saying something about protocol, about procedure, about rights. Then Adana appeared at her shoulder. Ma'am, he said, keeping his voice low. Torres has detained your administrator. There's a forensics team arriving in about 8 minutes for the building systems terminal, and... He paused, and she could hear in the pause that this was the part he'd been debating, saying, The aide just told the colonel about the 4 missing pages. Emily kept walking. She had a patient to check and a dog to get back to, and 6 hours before she had to sit in front of a review board and reconstruct 14 months of institutional abuse with documentation she'd been carrying in a password-protected drive on a thumb drive in her locker since February. Adana, she said without stopping. Ma'am? Thank you. Yes, ma'am. She pushed through the bay doors. Behind her in the main corridor, she could still hear Kane's voice, less controlled now, climbing in register, the performance of authority beginning to crack at the seams as the man beneath it started to understand what it felt like when the ground underneath you was no longer solid and the people around you had stopped pretending otherwise. She didn't stop to listen. Bay 3's patient, a young specialist with shrapnel in his left arm, and the dazed expression of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for several hours and was now experiencing its departure, looked up when she came in and said, Is it true you calmed down a military dog with like 3 words? Emily checked his IV line, took his pulse, marked his chart. 2 words, she said. What were they? She looked at him. He had a cut above his eye that someone had butterfly stripped in the field, and his hands were still doing the fine tremor she recognized from Duke, the body's way of processing what the mind wasn't ready to. You want something for the shakes? She said. He looked at his hands like he hadn't noticed them. Is it that obvious? No, she said, which was mostly true. Normal response. You've been through something. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. We all have. He looked at her with the kind of direct assessment that people make when they've spent time in environments where correctly reading other people was the difference between bad outcomes and worse ones. You have too, huh? Not today. I mean, in general. Emily marked the chart. Get some rest, she said. You're going to feel a lot worse before you feel better, and then you're going to feel fine. Is that what happened with you? She clicked her pen and put it in her pocket and looked at him once more before she turned to leave. She didn't answer, but she didn't say no either. The corridor outside was quieter now. The immediate emergency had moved from acute response into managed recovery, which was a different energy, still demanding, but sustained rather than spiked. She could hear from the direction of the main entrance the sounds of the building systems forensics team arriving, equipment being wheeled across the lobby's tile floor. She went to check on Duke. He was where she'd left him, in the alcove, lead still clipped to the bench bracket. He was lying down with his head on his front paws, and when she came around the corner, he lifted it and looked at her with the same concentrated, uncertain attention he'd had in the enclosure, but steadier than it had been then. Something had been established between them in that enclosure that was still holding, even across the distance and the noise and the hours between. She sat on the bench beside him. He put his head against her leg. She sat there for 4 minutes. She tracked it on the clock mounted above the storage cabinet, without doing anything. Not reviewing charts, not thinking through her documentation for the 1800 hearing, not cataloging the list of things that still needed doing before the end of her shift. She just sat, with her hand on Duke's head, and let the 4 minutes be 4 minutes. Then she stood, unclipped his lead from the bracket, and walked him back toward the east wing. She was rounding the corner toward the clinical coordinator's station when her radio, functional again since the building system's restore, crackled, and Priya's voice came through with the particular careful modulation of someone delivering information they're not certain of the full implications of. Emily, Dr. Marsh is in the coordinator's office. He says he needs to show you something from the security footage review. He says, Priya paused. He says Kane didn't just make the phone call about the kennel this morning. Emily stopped walking. Duke stopped beside her. He's been doing it for 3 months, Priya said. Different situations, different setups. The forensics team found the access logs. Another pause. Emily, the surgical supply report. They found the original filing in Kane's private administrative drive. He edited it himself before sending it back up the chain. The corridor held still around her. Somewhere, a monitor beeped. The ventilation hummed. Duke pressed slightly against the side of her leg, warm and solid, and she felt his breathing, in, out, steady. 3 months of documented interference. The quality control report altered and returned. The kennel, engineered. Whatever else was in those access logs that she hadn't found yet, hadn't known to look for. 14 months of being told, in ways institutional and personal, that she didn't belong here, that she was too quiet, too careful, too much of something that didn't fit a category they had ready for her. She stood in the corridor and understood, with the particular clarity that comes not from any single moment, but from the accumulation of many, that the thing she'd been surviving was no longer something she had to survive quietly. Tell Marsh I'm on my way, she said. She turned the corner. She didn't see the figure standing at the end of the corridor. Kane, flanked by Torres, the administrator's face white and stripped of its performance now, looking at her with an expression she would later struggle to name. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't quite fear. It was the look of a man who had built a very careful architecture of control and was watching it reveal for the first time the dimensions of everything it was built on top of. He said her name. Just that, Dawson, the way a person says a name when they have no next sentence ready. She looked at him across the length of the corridor. Duke, beside her, raised his head and looked at Kane, too, and made the low sound, not quite a bark, not quite a growl, that Emily had heard from him at the beginning of the day. Not aggression. Recognition. The sound of an animal that had learned, through long and painful experience, to identify the specific quality of someone who had caused harm. She held Duke's lead steady. She didn't say a word. She She walked past Victor Kane and through the door at the end of the corridor, and behind her she heard Torres say, very quietly, to the man standing between them, "Sir, you need to come with us." The coordinator's office was small and smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, and Marsh had the security footage pulled up on the hospital's auxiliary monitor in a way that told Emily he'd been in here for a while, working backward through timestamps with the methodical attention of a man who needed to be certain before he said anything out loud. He looked up when she came in. He looked at Duke. He looked at her. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. Duke settled near her feet without being told, which was the kind of thing that would have been remarkable 2 hours ago, and now simply was. Marsh turned back to the monitor. He had 3 windows open, different camera feeds, different timestamps, and he walked her through them without preamble, the way someone presents evidence when they're still processing what it means while they're presenting it. The first clip was from 6 weeks ago. The hospital's main supply corridor, 11:40 p.m., a Tuesday. The building was at skeleton staff. The camera angle caught a partial view of the administrative elevator and the hallway leading to the records room, and at 11:47, Kane stepped out of the elevator carrying a laptop. He was in the records room for 19 minutes. He came out without the laptop. "The records room has a terminal connected to the hospital's internal document server," Marsh said. "Not the main network, the legacy system. Original filings live there before they're migrated to the central database, including your quality control report." Emily was watching the screen. "Second clip," he said. The second clip was from 9 weeks ago. Same corridor, 2:12 a.m. A different man this time, younger, familiar to Emily, after a moment as the building systems manager, whose name she'd never learned before today. Carrying something in a bag. In for 11 minutes, out again. Not looking at the camera, but not covering his face either. The casual movement of someone who had been told they had authorization and hadn't thought to question it. "Third," Marsh said. The third clip was from yesterday, Kane's office. Interior camera, which Kane had apparently forgotten about or assumed was decorative. The small unit mounted above the door that fed into the building's security system as part of a post-renovation upgrade 2 years ago. He was on the phone. The audio was poor, fragmented by the distance from the camera's built-in mic, but Marsh had written down what he'd been able to reconstruct on a legal pad in handwriting that got tighter and more controlled as the list got longer. Emily read it. She read it twice. "He knew the military convoy was using Route 9, she said. "That fragment is unclear. It could be—" "No." She pointed to the third line. "That's the convoy designation. It's a number-letter combination that's not in general use. He knew the route." Marsh was very still. "He couldn't have arranged the ambush," she said, because she needed to say it to hear how it sounded, and it sounded, even as she said it, like something she wasn't ready to dismiss. The scale of that is, I know what it sounds like. Who else has seen this? Reed's aide, 40 minutes ago." Marsh paused. "That's why the forensics team expanded their scope. They're not just looking at the kennel access anymore." She set the legal pad down. She stood up and looked at the wall for a moment, not at anything on it, just at a fixed point, the way you look at something neutral when you're processing something that isn't. She'd come here because of a quality control report, supply discrepancies, falsified numbers in a surgical inventory system. That was the thing she'd documented, the thing she'd filed 3 separate complaints about, the thing that had started the 14 months of systematic pressure to remove her. She'd assumed it was corruption in the ordinary sense, someone with a financial interest in the discrepancy, someone protecting a vendor relationship, someone skimming, the kind of administrative misconduct that was common enough to have its own vocabulary. She had not assumed it went anywhere near a classified military transport route. "Emily," Marsh said. He almost never used her first name. The fact that he did now indicated something about where he was with this. "Whatever's in those supply records, whatever you found in that report, it's connected to something I don't have the clearance to understand. And I don't think you were ever just a problem employee he wanted gone." She turned back from the wall. "I was a witness," she said. "I found the discrepancy, and I documented it, and I filed it, and he couldn't make the documentation disappear without it looking like the documentation had disappeared." She stopped. "So he tried to make me disappear instead." Marsh nodded slowly. The kennel wasn't about the kennel, she said. No. Outside the coordinator's office, the corridor sounds had shifted again. A new register of activity, purposeful and organized in a way that was different from the trauma response. The forensics team moving deeper into the building. She could hear it through the door, the specific audio of an investigation that had just expanded in scope, and under it, fainter, what sounded like a second military vehicle arriving at the main entrance. She picked up her radio. Priya. A beat, then. Here. The patients in bays 2 and 3, are they stable? 2 is sleeping. 3's been asking about the dog again. Despite everything, something loosened in her chest for approximately 1 second. Tell him the dog is fine. Has Reed's aide been in contact with the duty officer? Someone from Reed's team was at the nursing station 10 minutes ago looking for you. I told them you were in the coordinator's office. I'm coming out. She clicked off. She looked at Marsh. The review is at 1800. They're going to want you there. I know. He was still looking at the monitor. Emily. He stopped, started again. I recommended you for this assignment this morning because Priya told me you had animal experience. I had no idea it was going to... He stopped again. It's okay? It's not, actually. He used my assessment request to put you in that room. He used a lot of things, she said. He had 14 months of practice. She opened the door. Duke was on his feet before she was fully upright, which was the dog equivalent of, I've been waiting. She took his lead. The corridor outside had 2 people in it she didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, military bearing, the specific kind of ID badges that indicated federal attachment rather than base assignment. One of them looked at her with the immediate recognition of someone who'd been briefed on what she looked like. Ms. Dawson, Colonel Reed needs you in the second-floor conference room, now. In a minute. I need to secure the dog. Ma'am, he said now. She looked at the agent. She looked at Duke. She turned back to the coordinator's office. Marsh, can you stay with him? Marsh came to the door, looked at Duke, looked at Emily. He'd spent his career with animals. He understood what she was asking. Yes. She handed the lead to Marsh. Duke looked at her when the lead changed hands with an expression that was complicated in the specific way that dogs' expressions are complicated when they've decided to trust someone and that someone is leaving. She put her hand on his head once, briefly. Stay, she said, and then quieter. I'll be back. She went with the agents. Thus, the second-floor conference room was not a conference room anymore. Someone had converted it in the last 2 hours into something closer to a command post. Additional monitors on the main table, a secure comms unit against the far wall, personnel she didn't recognize occupying positions around the perimeter. Reed was at the head of the table with his aide and a woman in civilian clothes who had the precise posture and deliberate stillness of federal law enforcement. Emily sat down when they indicated the chair across from Reed. She was still in her scrubs. She had not had anything to eat since 6:30 that morning, and she was aware of this in the abstract, the way you're aware of things your body is telling you when your mind has other priorities. Reed looked at her across the table. Tell me about the supply report, he said. All of it. What you found, when you found it, what you did with it. She told him. She laid it out the way she'd rehearsed it in her head over the past 3 months. Not emotionally, not with editorializing, just the sequence of events and what she'd observed and what she'd documented and what had happened to each document she'd filed. Reed and the federal agent listened without interrupting. The aide took notes. The personnel around the perimeter didn't move. When she finished, there was a short silence. You have the originals, Reed said. Copies. On a drive in my locker. We need those. I know. I'll get them before 1800. The federal agent leaned forward. Her name, Emily had gathered, was Vasquez. The discrepancies in the surgical supply report, the specific vendor codes you flagged. Did you run those codes? Against what database? Any. The hospital's internal system showed them as registered vendors. I couldn't cross-reference against federal procurement records from my access level. Vasquez glanced at Reed. Something passed between them. Not a surprise, more the confirmation of a thing they'd already suspected. The vendor codes are shells, Vasquez said. We've been tracing a procurement fraud network connected to military medical supply contracts for 7 months. 3 facilities, 2 states. She paused. Black Ridge was our tertiary target. We didn't have an internal source who could access the paper trail. Emily understood what that meant a half second before Vasquez said it. You found it by accident, Vasquez said. And Kane knew you'd found it, and he couldn't let you stay. The conference room held its stillness. Emily heard the secure comms unit emit a short tone, heard one of the perimeter personnel respond to it in a low voice. The convoy, Emily said, Route 9. Vasquez's expression didn't change, which was itself an answer. That's outside my scope to discuss, Vasquez said. What I can tell you is that the investigation expanded approximately 90 minutes ago, and that your documentation is now material evidence in a federal case. Emily looked at Reed. There are people above Kane, she said, in this building or connected to it. We don't know the full structure yet, he said, but Kane isn't the top. Reed's jaw moved slightly. We don't know. She sat with that for a moment. The 14 months of pressure, the filed reports, the kennel, the edited documents, the phone call Marsh had identified on the security footage, the number-letter combination that shouldn't have been in anyone's vocabulary outside classified channels. She'd come here as a nurse who'd found a discrepancy in a supply report. She had apparently been, without knowing it, standing inside something much larger than a supply report for over a year. What do you need from me, she said, before 1800? The drive, Reed said, a formal sworn statement covering everything you just told me, and he paused, and for a moment something beneath the command face surfaced briefly, something that was trying to communicate something that wasn't in the briefing. Emily, are you all right? It was the first time he'd used her first name in front of other people. She noticed it. From the small shift in Vasquez's attention, Vasquez noticed it too. I'm fine, Emily said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He'd asked her a real question, not a procedural one, and he was watching her face for a real answer. This was the thing about Reed, the things she'd known about him from before, from the context that nobody in this hospital had known existed, that underneath the command structure was a person who understood that the people in his sphere were human before they were assets, and who occasionally, carefully, let that understanding show. I'm functioning, she said, which was different from fine, and they both knew it, and he nodded like it was the answer he'd expected. Go get the drive, he said. Come back. We'll do the statement. She stood. She was almost at the door when Vasquez said, Ms. Dawson? She turned. The building systems manager, Vasquez said. The man who made the remote access to the kennel gate. He's been in custody since 1400. He's talking. She paused. He says Kane told him it was a controlled safety test, that it was authorized, that no one would be hurt. Another pause. He didn't know your background. Kane didn't tell him who you were. Emily looked at her. Kane didn't know either, she said. Not fully. Nobody here did. Vasquez studied her for a moment with the assessment expression of someone whose job required accurate reading of people under pressure. That bothered you, she said, being unknown. No, Emily said. What bothered me was what they did with what they assumed. She went to get the drive. The locker room was on the ground floor past the main nursing station, and she had to pass the administrative wing to get there. The hallway outside Kane's office had 2 federal agents in it and a strip of restricted access tape across the door that hadn't been there 4 hours ago. His assistant, a young man named Duval, who had always been polite to Emily in the specific way of people who are polite to everyone because they've learned their proximity to power doesn't protect them, was sitting in the waiting area with the hollow expression of someone whose world has just reorganized itself around a new and unwelcome set of facts. He looked up when she passed. He started to say something. She slowed. I didn't know, he said. Whatever. I didn't know any of it. She looked at him. He was 24, maybe 25, with the specific misery of someone who has been loyal to the wrong person and is only now calculating what that cost. I know, she said. Because she did. She'd watched him for 14 months and he was not complicit. He was just young and in proximity, and now he was going to have to give a statement to people with federal credentials, and it was going to be the worst week of his life, probably. What's going to happen? He said. She didn't have a clean answer. She had a real one. I don't know exactly, but if you tell them everything you know, it'll be better than if you don't. She kept walking. The locker room was empty. She opened her locker, pushed past her spare set of scrubs and the emergency granola bar she'd been meaning to eat for 6 days, and found the thumb drive in the inner pocket of her civilian jacket, where she'd been keeping it since February, which was when she'd first understood that the edited version of her report wasn't a clerical error. She held it in her palm for a moment. Small thing, unremarkable. The weight of it was less than an ounce. She closed her locker and turned around. Hollis was in the doorway. Emily hadn't heard her come in. Hollis was standing with her arms crossed in the way she stood when she was managing discomfort, and her face had moved fully now out of the contempt register and into something Emily had never seen on her before. A kind of stripped-down uncertainty, like a wall with the paint off. "I didn't know about the kennel," Hollis said. "The remote gate. I didn't know that was... I thought it was equipment." "Did you know about the phone call to the systems manager?" Hollis's silence was its own answer. "You suspected," Emily said. "I thought..." Hollis stopped. "I thought he wanted you gone. I thought it was administrative. I didn't know he'd... I wouldn't have..." "What did you do, Diane?" The use of her first name landed. Hollis's posture shifted. "He asked me to document your entry into the enclosure as unauthorized," Hollis said. "I started the report." "Did you file it?" "I hadn't submitted it yet." Emily looked at her. "Then don't." Hollis blinked. "I'm not telling you to suppress anything," Emily said. "I'm telling you that an unsubmitted report you haven't filed is different from one you have. If you submit it now, knowing what you know now, that's a choice you own." She paused. "If you have something to tell the federal investigators, tell them. If you didn't participate in what Kane did, tell them that too." "They'll think I did." "Maybe. That's what investigations are for." Hollis looked at the floor, then at Emily. The expression on her face was hard to read. Not quite remorse, not quite relief, something that was trying to become one or the other and hadn't gotten there yet. "You should have been the charge nurse from the beginning," Hollis said. It came out quiet, and without the inflection of an apology, more like a statement of record. "Today in the Bay, the way you ran it, you should have been doing that." Emily held the drive in her closed fist and looked at the woman who had made 14 months of her professional life smaller than it needed to be, and she felt not nothing, but something more measured than nothing. The kind of complicated response that doesn't resolve into a single emotion because it isn't one thing. "I'm going upstairs," Emily said. "I have a statement to give." She was almost past Hollis and through the door when her radio cracked, not Priya's voice this time, but Reed's aide, clipped and fast. "Dawson, we need you in the conference room immediately. New development." "I'm on my way up." "Now. Marsh is with us. He found something else in the footage." A pause. And in the pause she could hear voices in the background, multiple people talking across each other, and underneath it all the specific frequency of a situation escalating. "Kane had a visitor last night. Someone who came in through the service entrance at 0200 and left at 0340. Emily was already moving. "We've identified the visitor," the aide said, "and if what we're seeing is accurate..." The radio cut out. She took the stairs at a run. She hit the second-floor landing at a run and pushed through the stairwell door, and the conference room was louder than she'd left it. Not chaotic, but pressurized in the way of a space where multiple people have simultaneously received information. They're still calibrating against what they thought they knew. Reed was standing. That alone told her something, because Reed was the kind of man who sat during briefings as a deliberate signal of control, and he was on his feet with his hands flat on the table looking at the monitor on the far wall. Marsh was in the corner with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who wished he hadn't found what he'd found. The monitor was showing a freeze frame from the service entrance camera. Timestamp, 2:14 a.m., the previous night. The image was high enough resolution that the face was identifiable. Male, 50s, civilian clothes, a specific way of holding his body that suggested military background, even in jeans and a field jacket. Emily looked at the face. She didn't recognize him. She said so immediately, because the room was waiting for her reaction and giving a false one would waste time. "I don't know him." Vasquez was at the monitor. "His name is Gerald Foss, retired colonel, Army procurement, Separated from service 4 years ago under an administrative review that got quietly closed. She tapped the screen. He's been a federal target for 6 months as a suspected coordinator in the supply fraud network. We didn't have him connected to Blackridge. Until now, Reed said. Until now. Vasquez turned from the screen. Kane and Foss have a documented prior relationship. They overlapped at Fort Braxton 11 years ago. We'd flagged the connection but couldn't tie it to active coordination. She looked at Emily. The visit last night ran 90 minutes. We have audio fragments from the service corridor mic. Not a full transcript. It's partial, degraded, but we have enough. She hit play. The audio was bad. Ambient noise, the hum of a building at night, two voices trying to be quiet in an enclosed space, which always has the paradoxical effect of making them more distinct. What came through in fragments was enough. Kane's voice, anxious in a register Emily had never heard from him before, talking about a timeline. Foss's voice, lower, steadier, saying something that included the words clean, and before they pull the logs, and something that might have been a name or might have been a designation, unclear. Then, cleaner than the rest, Kane. She's not gonna let it go. I've tried everything short of... And Foss. Then we escalate. You know what that means. The room was quiet when Vasquez stopped the playback. Emily understood what she'd just heard and felt the understanding settle into her body in a way that was cold and specific. Escalate. In the context of the kennel, of edited documents, of a man who'd already arranged for a controlled space to become uncontrolled, escalate meant something she didn't want to name in a room full of people, but whose shape was entirely clear. He was warned, Reed said. His voice was flat in a way that indicated he was managing something. Foss told him to move faster before the forensics team pulled the server logs. Which they pulled this morning, Vasquez said, because of the convoy, which Foss likely didn't anticipate. Can you connect Foss to the convoy? Emily said. Vasquez looked at her steadily. That's an active federal investigation. I know what it is. Can you connect him? A beat. We're working on it. Which meant yes, or close enough to yes that the distinction was procedural rather than substantive. Emily stood with that for a moment, the full shape of it, the thing she'd been standing adjacent to for 14 months without knowing the dimensions. A procurement fraud network running through military medical supply contracts, using falsified vendor records, with at least one administrator at a connected facility maintaining the cover and removing witnesses who got close to the paper trail. She had found a discrepancy in a supply report. She had filed it through the correct channels. She had been methodically, deliberately targeted for removal by a man who was himself being directed by someone with more reach and more to lose. Where's Foss now? She said. We had a team at his last registered address as of 90 minutes ago, Vasquez said. He's not there. He ran, Reed said. Not a question. Probably when the convoy response went to Blackridge and he realized the military footprint here was larger than Kane had told him to expect. Vasquez's voice was professionally neutral. We have coverage on his known contacts and financials. He won't get far. Emily looked at Reed. Kane knows Foss is in the wind. Probably. Which means Kane knows his insulation is gone. Whatever Foss was going to do to protect their arrangement, Kane can't count on it anymore. Reed nodded slowly. He's going to try to make a deal, Emily said, before the federal case is fully built. He's going to offer something in exchange for reduced exposure. People in his position usually do, Vasquez said. The question is what he has to offer. Emily looked at the monitor, at the frozen frame of Foss in the service corridor, the posture of a man who had operated for a long time in spaces where he understood the angles. And whether what he knows is worth more than what you can already prove. Vasquez looked at her with the careful attention of someone reassessing their read of a person. You've done this before too, she said. Not accusatory, genuinely observational. Different context, Emily said. Same shape. Reed's aide appeared at his shoulder. The aide said something low, and Reed turned to the secure comms unit on the wall, and for a moment the room subdivided, Vasquez moving to her own phone, the perimeter personnel shifting, the aide typing something on a secondary terminal. Emily stood in the middle of it and breathed. She was still holding the thumb drive. She set it on the table in front of Reed's position. He glanced at it, glanced at her, and she said, "Full documentation. Original report, comparison version, 3 filed complaints with timestamps, and Kane's response correspondence." She paused. "There's also a 4th file. Personnel actions against me over the past 14 months. Schedule changes, write-ups, unfounded complaints. I documented everything in sequence." She had done this the way she did most things, quietly, consistently, without announcing it, in the evenings after shifts when she was alone in her apartment with her laptop and the particular focused attention of someone who understood that the record you create is the only thing that can't be argued with later. Vasquez, still on her phone, glanced at the drive. Something shifted in her expression. Recognition of a different kind, the expression of an investigator encountering evidence better organized than they expected, and understanding what that meant about the person who'd compiled it. The aide looked up from the terminal. "Colonel, Kane's legal representative is requesting a formal interview with federal counsel. He's citing cooperation." The room went quiet. Reed looked at Vasquez. Vasquez had ended her call and was looking at the table with the specific expression of someone performing rapid calculations. "He's moving fast," she said. "He knows Foss is gone," Reed said. "What does he have?" the aide asked. "That's what the interview is for." Vasquez picked up the thumb drive from the table, looked at it. "This changes the interview," she said to Emily. "Whatever Kane thinks he's offering, you've already documented it. He doesn't have the leverage he thinks he has." "Good," Emily said. The formal interview with Kane happened at 16:30 in a room Emily wasn't in and wasn't supposed to know the details of, except that Priya texted her at 16:47 with the message, "He looks terrible. Someone told me he asked for water twice, and they took 20 minutes to bring it," which was not exactly intelligence, but told her something about the temperature of the room. She spent the hour between the conference and the interview doing the job she'd come in to do that morning. It felt important to do that. Not as a statement, not as performance. She wasn't performing anything for anyone right now, but because the patients in bays 2 and 3 were still patients, and the specialist with the shrapnel wound was running a low fever that needed monitoring, and the ventilator in bay 2 that she'd flagged this morning had still not been formally logged with maintenance, and someone needed to make sure that happened in writing. She did it all. She wrote the maintenance request herself and sent it to 3 separate recipients so it couldn't be lost in a single inbox. Priya found her at the medication cart at 17:10. "The charge position," Priya said without leading up to it. "Hollis submitted a request to HR this afternoon. She's requesting a review of the reporting structure for our floor." Emily looked at her. "She also withdrew the incident report," Priya said. "The one she was writing about this morning." "I know. Do you know she CC'd Vasquez on the withdrawal?" Emily hadn't known that. She thought about it for a moment. Diane Hollis, who had spent 14 months treating her as an inconvenient presence, CC'ing a federal investigator on a document withdrawal. It was the action of someone who had made a calculation about which side of an investigation they wanted to be on and was moving accordingly. It wasn't courage. It wasn't contrition, exactly. It was pragmatic in the way that institutional people are pragmatic when the institution shifts under them. It was also, in its way, more than Emily had expected. "Okay," she said. Priya studied her. "You're not going to say anything else about that?" "What else is there to say? Most people would be, I don't know, angrier." Emily looked at the medication cart. At the organized rows of vials and blister packs, the color-coded labels, the system she'd memorized in her first week and used every day since with the particular satisfaction of knowing exactly where everything was. "I've been angry," she said. "For most of the last 14 months, some amount of the time. It didn't help much." She pulled the next chart. Being right helped. Documentation helped. Today helped. "Today was terrifying," Priya said. "Yes." Emily looked at her. Really looked at her, the way she hadn't had time to do all day. Priya had been on her feet for 10 hours. She had bags under her eyes and a coffee stain on her left sleeve, and she was still there, still running information between the people who needed it, still doing the thing she always did, which was see what needed doing and do it. "Are you okay?" Priya blinked. "I was going to ask you that." "I asked first." A pause. "I'm tired," Priya said, "and I'm..." There's a lot to process. There is. What happens now to the hospital, to all of it? Emily set down the chart. I don't know exactly. The investigation runs its course. If Kane cooperates, it shapes what comes out and when. Either way, the supply records are evidence now, and whatever Foss was running through those vendor codes gets unwound by people who are equipped to unwind it. She paused. The hospital keeps running. It was running this morning before any of this happened. It was running badly, Priya said. In some ways, in others it was running fine. She picked the chart back up. The patients got good care today. Priya was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. They did. The 1800 review convened in the second-floor conference room with the same people plus 3 additions, a military JAG officer, a federal prosecutor Emily hadn't met, and a hospital board representative who had arrived sometime in the last hour looking like a man who had received a phone call he wished he could unreceive. Emily gave her statement. She had given formal statements before, in different rooms, to different authorities, about different things, and the skills she'd developed then, the ability to be precise and sequential, and to separate what she knew from what she inferred and to say clearly which was which, served her now in a way that nothing in her nursing training had specifically prepared for. She went through it in order. The supply discrepancy, the report, the return of the edited version, the subsequent personnel actions, the kennel, the secondary gate, the audio fragments. She laid it out with the same precision she used to lay out medication schedules, and when she was done, the room was quiet in a way that had weight. The JAG officer said, "You maintained copies of everything." Yes. For how long? Since the second report came back with pages missing. 3 months. Yes. He looked at Reed. Something moved between them that Emily didn't have the context to fully read, but its general meaning was clear enough. The prosecutor said, "Ms. Dawson, I want to be specific about something. The actions taken against you over the past 14 months, the personnel write-ups, the schedule manipulation, the kennel incident today, these are going to be relevant to federal charges against Kane that go beyond the fraud investigation. Do you understand what that means? It means he endangered me as part of an effort to protect a criminal operation. In part, yes." The prosecutor looked at her files. "It also means you're a material witness in a federal case, and your documentation is likely to be central evidence." She paused. Kane's attorney this afternoon characterized this morning's kennel incident as a facility safety failure and attempted to position you as having voluntarily assumed risk. We're going to need your full account of what you understood about the lock and the secondary gate access at the time. I understood the radio was down and the lock had been engaged from outside, Emily said. I didn't know who had done it at that point. I knew it wasn't an equipment failure because of the sequence, radio first, then the lock, then the secondary gate. Equipment failures don't happen in that order. You didn't know it was Kane at the time. Not with certainty, I suspected. Why didn't you attempt to signal through the observation window? Marsh was already trying to restore the radio. Signaling wouldn't have opened the lock faster than what he was doing, and any abrupt movement from me at that point would have re-escalated the dog. The prosecutor made a note. You made a tactical decision. I made the only reasonable decision available. A brief pause in the room. Reed said, That's accurate. The board representative, who had said nothing until this point, cleared his throat. He was a man named Whitmore, gray-haired, in an expensive suit that looked wrong in this room, and he had the air of someone who had spent years attending to the hospital's public profile and was only now understanding that the profile had been maintained by a man who was about to be federally indicted. On behalf of the board, he said, I want to state for the record that the hospital's administration takes full responsibility. Sir, Vasquez said, not unkindly. Now is not the time for institutional statements. Whitmore closed his mouth. Reed looked at Emily. The euthanasia order on the dog. Where does that stand? It was the question she hadn't expected him to ask in this room, in this context, and the fact that he asked it told her something about what he was tracking. Unsigned as of this morning, she said. Marsh has the file. I want it formally withdrawn, Reed said. Tonight, before this meeting closes. He looked at Marsh, who had been in the corner again. Marsh appeared to prefer corners, and who nodded. Already drafted, Marsh said. I need one signature. Mine, Reed said. After this. Kane's formal arrest happened at 1920. Emily was not in the room. She was in the East Wing corridor with Duke, walking him in the slow, deliberate loop that Marsh had prescribed as part of his initial assessment protocol. Consistent movement, low stimulation, handler present. She'd been doing it for 20 minutes, and Duke had been settling incrementally with each circuit, the way he did gradually, in the specific way that wasn't performance or training response, but actual decompression. She heard the change in the building's audio, the front entrance, voices, the specific sound of institutional authority being exercised in a formal setting. She didn't stop walking. Duke's ears moved toward the sound, and then back to her, tracking both. Priya appeared at the end of the corridor. They took him out the front, she said. In handcuffs. She paused. A lot of people saw. Emily kept walking. Duke kept pace with her. How did he look? She said. Priya considered this. Small, she said. He looked small. Emily nodded. She'd seen it before, the specific contraction of a person who has spent years occupying space through the authority they've been granted when that authority is removed. The person that's left is often genuinely smaller than the position made them appear. Kane had probably been that smaller person the whole time. The position had just given him room to expand into something that could cause damage. Martinez asked me to tell you he's putting in for a commendation, Priya said, for your clinical coordination today. Tell him to put his energy into the blood bank follow-up. We're still low on ONEG. Emily, I'm serious about the blood bank. I know you are. Priya came down the corridor and fell into step beside her for a moment, which meant Duke was now being walked by two people, which he seemed uncertain about but willing to accept. Let someone say thank you. Emily looked at her sideways. Thank you, Priya said. For not disappearing when he wanted you to. Emily was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed around them. Duke's nails clicked on the tile floor, even and steady. I almost did, she said. It came out without planning. Honest in the way things are honest when you're tired and the performance of having everything managed is running low on fuel. 3 months ago, after the second report came back, I almost decided it wasn't worth what it was costing. What stopped you? She looked down at Duke. He was walking with his head up now, still cautious, still monitoring the environment with the hypervigilance of an animal that had learned the world was unpredictable, but moving. Forward. 1 foot. I'm not good at leaving things unfinished, she said. The federal warrant for Gerald Foss came through at 2100, Vasquez told her briefly, on her way out. There was a task force. There were 3 coordinated locations being searched, and the structure of the procurement fraud network was broader than the 6-month investigation had initially indicated. She didn't give details. She gave Emily a card with a federal case number on it and told her she'd be contacted within 72 hours for additional statement processing. Emily took the card. One more thing, Vasquez said at the door. The 4 missing pages from your report, they contain vendor payment routing information. We've been trying to find that routing for 4 months, she paused. You had it the whole time. I had a copy, Emily said. You had a copy, Vasquez agreed. She looked at her for a moment. You're going to be in a federal proceeding for a while, Ms. Dawson. I want you to know that's not a punishment. It's... She seemed to consider her words. Your 14 months of documentation is better than most of what professional investigators produce. I want it on record that I said that. She left. Emily stood in the corridor. She was aware, standing there, of how much of her body had been holding itself together all day through the specific kind of will that doesn't announce itself but costs something. The shaky quality that's underneath the functional surface, that you don't feel until you stop. She stood with it for a moment, didn't try to push it down, didn't try to name it, just let it be what it was, which was exhaustion and relief and something more complicated than either. The particular aftermath of a day in which everything you'd been carrying for a very long time had finally been seen by people with the authority to do something about it. Duke pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his head. She was still standing there when Reed's aide found her and said the colonel needed 1 more minute of her time before he left the building. She followed the aide back to the conference room, which was emptier now. Whitmore gone, the extra personnel gone, just Reed and a single aide packing up the comms equipment. Reed looked at her when she came in. He looked at Duke. He looked at her again with the expression she'd seen twice today, the one that was doing several things at once, controlled in its presentation, but not fully controlled underneath. "The review board at Fort Vanguard," he said. "Formal proceedings. K9s conduct, the fraud network, your documentation. It convenes in 10 days. He paused. "They're going to want you there. Full account, on record, in front of the board. I'll be there." "It's going to be public," he said. "The board proceeding is closed, but the outcome, the formal findings, those go into the public record." He watched her face. "Everything that's been said about you here, every write-up, every characterization Kane put into your personnel file, those get reviewed, officially, on record." She understood what he was telling her. Not just that the board would review them, that they would be contradicted by the same institutional record that had been used to build them, formally, publicly, permanently. "Okay," she said. He nodded. He started to turn to the aide and then stopped. "Emily." He said it the way he'd said it before, the weight of a name in context. "When this is done, the board, the federal case, when the procedural part is finished," he paused. He was choosing words with the care of a man who doesn't often have to choose them carefully because he usually just says what he means. "There are programs, Fort Vanguard, K9 rehabilitation, veteran support coordination. We've been underfunded and understaffed in ways that have consequences." He glanced at Duke. "We could use someone who knows what they're doing." She looked at him. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're a lot of things," he said. "Nursing is one of them." She held that for a moment. Duke was looking at the door, not anxiously, just the curiosity of an animal that understood that the day was winding toward something, though it didn't know what. "Let me get through the board proceeding first," she said. "Fair," Reed said. He left. The aide followed. The room was quiet. Emily stood for a moment in the emptied conference room with the dog that had stopped trusting the world for 8 months and decided, today, in an enclosure with a locked door and a broken radio, to try again. She thought about the thumb drive, now in federal custody. The 4 missing pages. 14 months of documentation, sitting in a password-protected file, waiting for a context in which it could finally mean something. She thought about what she'd told the specialist in Bay 3. "You're going to feel a lot worse before you feel better, and then you're going to feel fine." She picked up Duke's lead. She was almost at the door when her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, expecting Priya, expecting Vasquez, expecting the next procedural step in the long chain of procedural steps that the next 10 days were going to be. The number was a Stonehaven area code she didn't recognize. She answered. A voice she didn't know. Male, middle-aged, slightly breathless in the way of someone who's been waiting to make a call and has finally made it. "Is this Emily Dawson?" "Yes." My name is Robert Ewan. James Ewan was my son." A pause. "The people at Fort Vanguard told me you were with Duke today, that you're the reason he's still—" He stopped. "I've been trying to find out what happened to him for 8 months. Since James—" Another stop. Emily stood in the doorway with her hand on the doorframe and Duke beside her, and the weight of the day in her body, and she understood. In the way you understand things that aren't simple. That this was the thing underneath all the other things. The reason Duke couldn't find a placement. The reason he'd stopped eating, stopped responding, started attacking. He'd been looking for the one person who was gone, and finding no one who could tell him what had happened or what came next. "Mr. Ewan?" she said carefully. "Yes. I'm with him. Is he going to be okay?" She looked at Duke. He was looking up at her with the quiet, uncertain attention of an animal doing the hard work of deciding to trust again. And she felt the question in a way that went past the clinical and into something older and more fundamental. "Yes," she said. "He's going to be okay." Silence on the line, then, "I have things. James's things. His vest, There are things that were Duke's. Gear. A specific toy I didn't know where to send them. I've had them for 8 months. Emily closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. I'll give you an address, she said. Send them to me. I'll make sure he gets them. She was still on the phone with Robert Ewan, writing down his contact information on the back of Vasquez's federal case card, when she heard, from somewhere below, from the direction of the administrative wing, a sound she couldn't immediately identify. Not an alarm, not a medical emergency. Footsteps, fast, and a voice she almost recognized, and then another voice she recognized completely. Torres, sharp and commanding, and under it a third voice that was higher and urgent in the specific register of someone delivering information they'd just received and hadn't fully processed yet. She ended the call. She looked at Duke. She went to the stairwell and looked down toward the ground floor. Vasquez was in the lobby, coat half on, phone to her ear, face arranged in the expression of someone receiving news that changes the operational picture. Beside her, Torres. And beside Torres, the aide who had been packing the comms equipment 60 seconds ago, holding a printout. Emily came down the stairs. Vasquez looked up. Boss, she said. He didn't run. Emily looked at her. He came here, Vasquez said. He's in the building. The word here landed differently than most words land. Not abstract, not a future problem. Here, in this building, in the same building where the patients from the convoy were still in recovery beds, where the forensics team had been working for hours, where Duke was standing beside her with his lead in her hand, and the evening had seemed, for exactly 4 minutes, like it was winding towards something manageable. Where? Emily said. Service level, East Wing. Vasquez was already moving, phone still at her ear, her other hand signaling Torres in a shorthand they'd clearly developed before today. He used a contractor badge, old access credential, probably from the renovation 2 years ago. The system flagged it on the way in, but the alert went to the building systems terminal, which has been offline since the forensics team. He knew that, Emily said. Vasquez looked at her mid-stride. He knew the terminal was offline. That's why he came in tonight and not earlier. Emily was moving too, not following Vasquez exactly, moving in parallel, because she knew the East Wing service level in a way that Vasquez didn't. She'd been down there twice today. She knew the layout, the alcoves, the specific configuration of the K9 suite, and the coordinator's office, and the corridor that connected them. What does he want? The server terminal in the records room is on the legacy system, Vasquez said, separate from the forensics team's access point. If he's carrying any kind of overwrite device, he's going for the original filing, Emily said. The supply report. My original. Vasquez stopped walking for 1 second, looked at her. Where's the records room terminal relative to your position? 2 corridors east, 60 feet from the K9 suite. You are not going down there. I know the space. You don't. Ms. Dawson. I'm not asking, Emily said. Which wasn't quite accurate, and they both knew it. But the tone was the tone, and Vasquez, who was a person accustomed to assessing situations faster than most, made the calculation in about 2 seconds and said, Stay behind my team. Do not engage. Do you understand me? Yes. It wasn't a question, and Emily's answer wasn't quite a promise, but they were moving again, and the specifics of what each of them meant would be determined by what they found. The East Wing service corridor at 9:40 p.m. was the same concrete and industrial cleaner it had been that morning, the same hum of ventilation, the same quality of light from the overhead fixtures that had always made this part of the building feel like the inside of something functional rather than something designed to be inhabited. Torres went first with 2 agents, Vasquez behind them, Emily behind Vasquez with Duke on a shortened lead. She'd made him heel tight, close to her left leg, which he did with a precision that told her some of his training was still in there, underneath everything that had broken, waiting for a context in which it still applied. They moved quietly. Service corridors are good for quiet. Hard floors but no echo-producing angles, the ambient building noise providing cover, the layout straightforward in a way that ornate spaces aren't. The records room door was 50 feet ahead. It was open. Not forced, open. The lock was electronic and would have responded to the contractor credential, and whoever had issued that credential 2 years ago and never deactivated it had handed Foss something worth more than they knew. Torres held up a fist and everyone stopped. He and one agent went forward in the measured, deliberate way of people trained to enter uncertain spaces. The second agent stayed at the corridor junction. Vasquez positioned herself at the threshold. Emily stayed back. She heard from inside the records room the sound of equipment, typing, or something like typing, keystrokes, irregular, with pauses. Whoever was in there was working. She heard nothing else. No second person, no voice. One person, alone, doing something to a terminal that couldn't be done remotely because it was on the legacy system that wasn't connected to the main network, which was the only reason the forensics team hadn't already pulled everything off it. Torres went through the door. There were 4 seconds of very specific sound, movement, a voice she didn't recognize issuing a command in the flat mandatory tone of a federal officer, something hitting the floor, something else that was the acoustic signature of a person being physically stopped mid-motion. Then Torres. Clear. Vasquez went in. Emily counted to 3 and followed. Gerald Foss was on the floor with his hands being secured behind him by Torres's partner, and the expression on his face was one she'd seen before. Not on people who'd been caught doing something dramatic, but on people who'd almost made it. The specific expression of someone who ran the calculation correctly and still came up short by a margin they hadn't accounted for. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, from the particular adrenaline of failed control. On the terminal screen, a progress bar had been interrupted mid-process. Whatever he'd been running had been stopped at 63%. Vasquez looked at the screen, looked at the agent beside her. Can we recover what he deleted? Depends on what he got to before Torres. The agent was already at the keyboard. The legacy system runs older architecture. Deletions are logged, sometimes recoverable if the overwrite wasn't complete. He had maybe 4 minutes in here, Emily said. Everyone looked at her. The credential alert flagged and someone noticed and called it up the chain, she said. That took time. By the time it reached Vasquez's team and they moved, 4 minutes. Maybe 5. She looked at the progress bar. 63% in 4 minutes meant the file he'd been targeting was substantial, which meant he wasn't just deleting, he was pulling something, copying first, then deleting. Vasquez looked at Foss on the floor. What were you copying? Foss looked at the wall. The routing information, Emily said. Not to Foss, to Vasquez. The vendor payment routing, the 4 pages. He knew the original was here because Kane told him I'd filed it, and Kane knew the edited version had gone back up the chain, which meant someone had the original somewhere, and the original had the routing. She paused. He wasn't trying to destroy it. He was trying to take it, because the routing connects to accounts. Accounts connect to people above him in this. Vasquez looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd been periodically producing all day, the one that kept revising its assessment of who it was looking at. You should have been a federal investigator, she said. I'm a nurse, Emily said. It's the same skill set, mostly. You find what's wrong, and you trace it back to the source. Foss, from the floor, made a sound. It wasn't a word exactly, more the sound of someone who'd been operating for a very long time in a structure that kept him insulated from consequences, producing a noise that was the first unmanaged sound they'd probably heard from him. Something between a scoff and something less controlled. You have no idea, he said, to Emily specifically, with the particular contempt of a man addressing someone he'd dismissed and was still, even now, dismissing. What you got yourself into. She looked at him on the floor. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Kane in the corridor that afternoon, not with anger, not with triumph, with the steady, factual attention of someone for whom this moment was information rather than theater. I know exactly what I got into, she said. I filed a quality control report 14 months ago. I used the correct channels. I documented everything when the channels failed. She paused. You did the rest. Torres pulled Foss to his feet. Foss's eyes stayed on Emily for a moment, calculating, still, even now, and then the calculation ran out and he looked away. The agent at the terminal said, 63% completion on the copy. We've got 37% of the file intact. The routing data he was after is in the first third of the document. He looked at Vasquez. We have it. The corridor outside had filled slightly. 2 more agents from the upper floor, Marsh appearing from the direction of the K9 suite, looking like a man who'd heard something and needed to know if it was what he thought it was. Emily looked at him and gave him a single nod. His shoulders dropped about an inch. Duke, beside her, had been still through the whole thing, not the stillness of a suppressed reaction, but the focused stillness of an animal doing what it was trained to do, reading the space, reading her, staying present. He leaned slightly against her leg when Foss was walked past them into the corridor, which might have been instinct, or might have been something older, the impulse to put himself between. She put her hand on his head. "Good boy," she said quietly. His tail moved, once, carefully, like something he wasn't quite ready to commit to but couldn't entirely suppress. Gerald Foss was transported at 2200 hours. The federal case expanded formally the following morning when the recovered routing data was processed and traced to 3 shell accounts connected to 2 additional former military procurement officers and a private contractor with Defense Department credentials. The indictments, when they came fast. The kind of fast that happens when investigators have been building a case for months and suddenly receive the final piece they couldn't locate. Victor Kane's cooperation agreement was substantially devalued when the routing data made his testimony less essential than his attorney had believed. The federal prosecutor called it a negotiating miscalculation. Kane received no deal. He received charges: federal fraud, obstruction, reckless endangerment, abuse of authority, and 3 counts related specifically to the manipulation of personnel processes in service of criminal concealment. His attorney filed 3 motions in the first week. All 3 were denied. Emily didn't follow the legal proceedings in detail. She had a job to do. The Fort Vanguard Review Board convened 9 days after the incident at Black Ridge, in a formal hearing room that was nothing like the hospital conference room that had served as a command post. This was institutional in the specific way of military spaces, with its oak paneling and its flag in the corner, and its particular quality of accumulated gravity, of decisions that had mattered being made here over years. Emily sat at the witness table in clean clothes, not her uniform. She didn't have one anymore, hadn't for years. And she gave her account to a 5-member board for 2 hours and 14 minutes, answering questions with the same sequential precision she'd used in the federal interview. And when it was over, the board chair looked at her across the room and said, "The record will reflect that Ms. Dawson's conduct throughout the period in question was not only appropriate but exemplary. All adverse personnel notations filed against her at Black Ridge Veterans Medical Center are formally reviewed and found to be without merit." He said it out loud, in a room, with people listening. She had known it was true for 14 months. Knowing something and having it said out loud in a formal record by a person with the authority to make it official are different experiences, and she hadn't fully understood how different until it happened. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying earlier, privately, at 3 a.m, 2 days after the incident, sitting on her kitchen floor with Duke's head in her lap because he'd been staying with her since Marsh cleared it, and she'd let about 20 minutes of the last 14 months out in the specific ugly way of someone who's been holding something too long and has finally reached a point where it's safe to put it down. She'd felt embarrassed about it for approximately 30 seconds, and then decided she didn't have the energy to be embarrassed and let it run its course, and made tea afterward and went to bed and slept better than she had in months. So when the board chair said those words in that room, what she felt wasn't the release she might have expected. It was something quieter, the specific satisfaction of a record being set right, of the institutional machinery that had been turned against her now doing what it was supposed to do, accurately reflecting what had actually happened. Reed was in the room. He was not on the board. The proceedings required independence, but he was present in his capacity as commanding officer of the Fort Vanguard K9 unit, and when she looked at him after the chair finished speaking, he gave her a single nod that contained, in its economy, everything he'd said in the hospital conference room and several things he hadn't said. She nodded back. After the formal session ended and the room was breaking apart into the smaller conversations that follow institutional events, Adana found her near the door. He looked different out of field gear, younger, somehow, though she'd have guessed young to begin with. He had the expression of someone who'd been thinking about something for 9 days and had decided to say it. "I told my team about you," he said. "The guys in my unit. What you did in the kennel, in the bay. All of it." "I just did my job," she said, which was the true answer, and also the insufficient answer, because her job on that day had been 7 different things, and she'd done all of them without stopping to announce it, which was the part people seemed to find striking. That's kind of the point, Adana said. Nobody knew. You just did it. He paused. There are people in my unit who've been through some bad deployments. Some of them are having a hard time right now. The kind of hard time that doesn't show up on X-rays. She looked at him. The K9 rehabilitation program Reed mentioned, he said. The Veteran Support Coordination. If that happens, if you're involved in building it, I think it would matter. He seemed slightly embarrassed by the length of this statement, which she found oddly humanizing. Anyway, I just wanted to say, thank you, Corporal. He nodded. He started to leave and then turned back. What did you say to Duke? The two words. In the kennel. She'd been asked this several times now, by different people. She'd given different partial answers, none of them quite complete, because the complete answer required explaining things about where she'd learned those words and what she'd learned them for, and that explanation was longer than any version of it she'd been prepared to give in a hospital corridor or a federal interview. She looked at Adana. I told him he was still here, she said. That's all. Just that he was still here, and that mattered. Adana was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said softly. Okay. The formal ceremony at Fort Vanguard happened 3 weeks later. It was smaller than the word ceremony implies. No parade ground, no crowd in the Hollywood sense. A courtyard, late afternoon, maybe 40 people. Military personnel, hospital staff who'd been invited, Vasquez and 2 members of her federal team, Robert Ewan in a dark jacket standing slightly apart from the groups with the careful stillness of a man who had been grieving for 8 months and was now being asked to also hold something like hope, which is harder than grief in its own way because grief at least knows its shape. Duke was there. He came in on lead, walking beside Emily, and he was not the animal who had been in that kennel 3 weeks ago. Not fully transformed, not some cinematic version of restored, because restoration doesn't work like that, and she knew it better than anyone. He still startled at certain sounds. He still tracked exits when he entered a room. He still had days that were harder than others, would probably always have them. But he ate consistently now. He slept. He'd figured out, slowly and with considerable repetition, that the person holding his lead was going to keep holding it, and that mattered to him in the bone-deep way that it matters to creatures who have lost everyone they trusted and decided, despite everything, to try once more. Reed presented the commendation himself. The Army Medical Service Corps Medal of Distinction, issued for exceptional clinical service, demonstrated leadership under combat-adjacent conditions, and actions that directly preserved military life and operational integrity. He read the citation in full, which is the formal protocol, and the citation was detailed in ways that made several people in the courtyard go quiet, because it listed specifically what she'd done and when and under what circumstances. And the cumulative picture of those details was different from any single detail on its own. When he pinned it, he said quietly, just to her, "You should have had this years ago." "I have it now," she said. He stepped back. He looked at her. And then, because he was Reed, and because this was a formal setting, and because he had never in her experience of him done anything primarily for performance, he didn't make a speech about her. He just said to the assembled people, in his carrying command voice, "She was the most capable person in this building on the worst day it's had in years. And before that, for 14 months, nobody here knew it." He paused. That's the thing about quiet strength. It doesn't need you to know. It just keeps working. Applause. Real applause. The kind that isn't polite. Adana clapping with the energy of someone who means it. Priya beside him with her eyes bright. Martinez somewhere in the back. Marsh, who had driven 40 minutes to be here and would not have missed it, standing with his hands making more noise than his size suggested. Hollis was not there. Emily had not expected her to be, and felt nothing particular about her absence. Hollis had made her choices and was living inside them, which was its own kind of consequence, less dramatic than K9s, and in some ways more honest. Robert Ewan came forward after the formal part ended. He was holding something, a worn tactical vest, military grade, with patches she recognized as K9 unit identifiers. He held it like it weighed more than it did. "This was James's," he said. "Duke wore it on deployment. I've had it—" He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to stopping mid-sentence. She could see that about him, the kind of person who pushed through. The stopping cost him something. I want him to have it back. If you think it would help. Emily took it from him carefully. She held it for a moment. Worn nylon, faded patches, the specific smell of something that had been in storage but before that had been somewhere real. She crouched beside Duke. He smelled it before she offered it. His nose came forward, quivering, and something happened in his face that she'd learned to read in the past 3 weeks. Not a simple emotion, not joy or grief alone, but the complicated, specific experience of an animal encountering something it thought was gone. Proof that the thing was real, that it had existed, that it was not lost so much as stored somewhere in a form it could still access. He pressed his nose into the vest. His whole body trembled, that fine tremor she recognized. And then it settled, and he looked up at her with an expression that was the truest thing she'd seen all afternoon. She put her hand on his chest, felt his heart. He remembers, she said to Robert Ewan, not trying to comfort him, just saying what was true. Ewan made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He crouched beside her, beside Duke, and put a shaking hand on the dog's head, and Duke, after one careful, assessing moment, leaned into it. They stayed like that for a while. The courtyard moved around them, conversations continuing, the ordinary social machinery of an event winding down. Emily stayed where she was, on one knee in a Fort Vanguard courtyard, holding a worn vest that belonged to a soldier who wasn't here anymore, beside a man who loved his son, and an animal who had been through something no creature should go through and had come out the other side with its capacity for trust, still, improbably, intact. She thought about the morning 3 weeks ago, the kennel door slamming shut, the decision she'd made in the time between the lock engaging and the secondary gate releasing, not a heroic decision, not a strategic one, but the only reasonable one available, which was to stay where she was and do what she knew how to do and trust that knowing how to do something was enough, even when no one watching believed it. She thought about 14 months of being told, in institutional and personal and procedural ways, that she was too quiet, too careful, too much of something that didn't fit the available categories. She thought about what it had cost her to stay, not just professionally, but in the subtler ways that sustained dismissal costs a person, the way it wears at your certainty about your own perception, the way it makes you question the record you know is accurate because everyone around you is insisting it isn't. She had not been wrong. She had never been wrong. She had been in possession of accurate information in an environment that had a structural interest in calling it inaccurate, and she had held on to it in a password-protected file on a thumb drive in her locker until the day an environment shifted and the information was finally seen by people with the authority to confirm what she'd always known. The lesson in that was not triumphant exactly. It was harder than triumph. It was the lesson that being right doesn't protect you, that documentation doesn't protect you, that doing everything correctly through the correct channels doesn't protect you from people who have decided you're a problem to be managed rather than a person to be seen. The protection, such as it is in the accumulation, in keeping the record, in not disappearing, in refusing to let the pressure of being disbelieved reshape your understanding of what you actually know. She had almost disappeared. She told Priya that, and it was true. 3 months ago, she had sat in her apartment after the 3rd failed report and looked at other hospitals, other cities, other positions, and she had thought seriously about the cost-benefit of continuing to exist in a space that had decided, on arrival, that she was the wrong kind of person. She'd thought about it for about a week, and then she'd made a 4th file, and a 5th, and she'd kept going to work and doing it the way she always did, thoroughly, quietly, without announcing it, because leaving something unfinished was not, in the end, something she was able to do. It was a character flaw as much as a virtue. She knew that. Stubbornness dressed as principle. She wasn't going to over-examine it. The point was, she'd stayed. And staying had turned out to matter. Not because staying is always the right answer, not because endurance is its own reward, but because the record she'd built by staying became the thing that dismantled everything that had been built against her. Duke lifted his head from the vest and looked at her. She looked back at him. 2 creatures who had been through something and were still here, on the other side of it, in a courtyard in the late afternoon with the desert light doing what desert light does at this hour, turning everything it touches the color of something that has survived. Reed appeared beside her. He didn't crouch. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked at Duke and Robert Ewan and the vest, and he was quiet for a moment before he said, "The rehabilitation program. I meant what I said. I know. The position is yours if you want it. Clinical coordinator, K9, and veteran support. You'd be building it essentially from scratch." He paused. "It won't be easier than what you've been doing." "I don't need it to be easy," she said. "I know that too." He looked at her one more time with the expression she'd stopped trying to fully decode, the one that held several things at once and had been doing so since the moment he'd seen her in the corridor and recognized her. "You've been doing the wrong job in the wrong place for someone with your background." "I've been doing the right job," she said. "I just needed the right place to catch up." He almost smiled, the controlled approximation of one. "Start Monday," he said. She looked at Duke, at Robert Ewan, who was still beside the dog with his hand on Duke's head, and an expression that was somewhere between grief and something else. Something that doesn't have a clean name. The feeling of a thread you thought was severed, still somehow connecting. At the courtyard around her, Priya in conversation with Adana, Marsh at the refreshment table eating something with the enthusiasm of a man who hadn't stopped for lunch, the late light on the walls. She thought, this is what after looks like. Not perfect, not resolved in the clean way of narratives that don't have to be lived in, but present, real. Her name on a record that finally said what was true. A dog beside her who had remembered how to trust, a purpose that had been waiting for the right context to become visible. She had been underestimated. It had cost her, and then it had cost them more. Not because she was exceptional, though she was, in ways she'd never announce, but because the thing they'd underestimated wasn't a person, not exactly. It was the record, the documentation, the fourth file, and the fifth, and the decision made in a quiet apartment in a bad week to keep going anyway. The refusal to let the pressure of being unseen reshape the truth of what she knew about herself. They had tried to make her disappear. She had simply kept showing up. "Monday," she said to Reed. She stood, and Duke stood with her. And she clipped the lead, and they walked back through the courtyard together. The woman they'd underestimated, and the dog they'd written off, both of them moving forward into what came next with the particular steadiness of things that have been tested by the worst conditions available and discovered, on the other side of it, that they were still standing.